Thwack! That is the sound of a composite bow firing an arrow at nearly 200 miles per hour. Thwack! That is the sound of it slamming into the back of a soldier marching in front of you. But the man doesn't scream. He doesn't fall. He doesn't even stumble. He just keeps walking. Picture this. You're standing on a dusty, scorching coastal road in what is now modern-day Israel. It is the morning of September 7th, 1191. The soldier nearest to you has 3 arrows sticking out of his back. The man next to him has 10. The entire rear guard looks less like an army and more like a migrating colony of porcupines. By all laws of biology, these men should be dead. Instead, they are marching in perfect unison, ignoring the steel shafts buried in their jackets. This is not a myth. This is the Battle of Arsuf, a collision that would redefine military discipline for centuries. It is the moment where the unstoppable force of the East, led by the legendary Sultan Saladin, crashed headfirst into the immovable object of the West, commanded by King Richard the Lionheart. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why these men are walking with arrows in their backs, you have to understand the trap they're walking into. This is the Third Crusade, but forget the romantic paintings of knights in shining armour. This is a horror story. 4 years ago, Saladin wiped out the Christian armies at Hattin. He didn't just beat them, he erased them. Now, Richard has returned to take the Holy Land back, but he is walking into a kill box. His objective is the port of Jaffa, 80 miles south. To get there, he has to march his army along a narrow coastal road. On his right is the sea, his only safety. On his left, the desert. And in that desert, Saladin has hidden 30,000 cavalrymen. They are the Shadow Army. History loves a good rivalry. Caesar and Pompey, Napoleon and Wellington. But the duel between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin stands alone. It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision of 2 completely different philosophies of war. Richard was a master of logistics. He knew that an army marches on its stomach, and in the desert, it marches on water. While his European rivals were obsessed with glory, Richard was obsessed with the supply chain. He was the CEO of a multinational corporation of death. His genius at Arsuf was his understanding of the patience of power. He knew that Saladin's army was faster, lighter, and more numerous. If Richard tried to chase them, he would lose. So he inverted the rules of engagement. He decided that his victory condition wasn't to kill the enemy. It was simply to ignore them. On the other side of the dunes sat Saladin. If Richard was the iron anvil, Saladin was the desert wind. He was a self-made man who had united the squabbling tribes of Egypt and Syria, but this strength was also his greatest weakness. Saladin's army was a coalition that expected quick victories. Every day the war dragged on without a decisive battle. Saladin's authority bled away. He needed Arsuf. He needed to crush Richard before the Crusaders reached Jaffa. To understand why the Battle of Arsuf didn't end in a massacre of the Christians within the first hour, we have to look at the geometry of the march. This wasn't a standard column of troops, it was a human tank. On the far right, hugging the coastline, was the baggage train protected by the fleet. On the exposed left, Richard created a living wall of infantry. Inside this protective shell rode the heavy cavalry, the nuclear weapon of the medieval world. The Knights Templar took the vanguard, and the Hospitallers took the rearguard. The infantry physically blocked the knights from charging, acting as the safety catch on Richard's gun. However, every machine has a breaking point. For this column, it was the rear guard. Saladin realised he couldn't crack the whole shell, so he decided to hammer the tail. He directed the bulk of his forces against the rear guard, trying to force them to stop and fight, which would create a gap in the line. The men holding this suicide post were the Knights Hospitaller, led by Grand Master Garnier de Nablus. Imagine being a Saracen archer on that day. You are arguably the most skilled marksman of your age. You have spent the entire morning firing arrow after arrow into the backs of the Christian infantry. And nothing is happening. The targets aren't falling. They are just absorbing your ammunition like a sponge. This invincibility wasn't a miracle, it was material science. The real hero of Arsuf was the humble garment known as the gambeson. It was constructed from up to 30 layers of linen or wool. When a light arrow from a Turkish composite bow struck this dense mat of fibre, the energy was dispersed instantly. The arrowhead would snag in the stuffing before it could touch the skin. However, there is a flip side to this protection. Physics demands a trade-off. The gambeson stopped the arrows, but it trapped the heat. The inside of a crusader's armour was a blast furnace. The temperature could easily reach 50 degrees Celsius. Dehydration was a faster killer than the Saracen arrows. Saladin saw this. He realised his arrows were useless at long range. If he wanted to crack the shell, he had to get closer. He ordered his men to switch to scimitars and maces. They rode right up to the Crusader line, so close that the Christians could see the whites of their eyes. The shadow army was no longer a shadow, it was a physical weight. By mid-afternoon, the heat had peaked. Inside the rear guard, Garnier de Nablu was watching his order bleed to death. The Saracens were swarming like angry hornets, hamstrunging the Hospitallers' horses. To a knight, a horse was not just an animal, it was his tank. Garnier couldn't take it anymore. He wrote to a messenger and said, "Sire, we are being pressed violently and are in danger of eternal infamy. We must charge." The message was relayed to Richard. The king's response? Wait. Richard saw that the main body of Saladin's army was still manoeuvring. He wanted a massacre, not a reprieve, so he sent the order back. Patience. You must endure. Minutes passed like hours. Another wave of arrows, another dozen horses screaming. Garnier sent a second message. "Sire, we are losing everything. Let us charge." Again, the message came back. "Wait, the time is not yet ripe, but there is a limit to discipline." Garnier looked around. He saw the sheer density of the enemy. He realized that if he waited any longer, there wouldn't be anyone left to charge. The chain of command was holding by a single thread, and then it snapped. It started with 2 men. Whatever plan Richard the Lionheart had drawn up, it evaporated in a single second. Garnier de Nablus and another knight named Baldwin de Caron could not wait another heartbeat. With a roar, they shouted St. George and spun their horses around. They burst out of the protective infantry screen and slammed directly into the Saracens. When the rest of the Hospitallers saw their Grandmaster charge, the dam broke instantly. They didn't wait for orders. Every single knight in the rear guard wheeled his horse and followed. The reaction moved up the line like a bolt of electricity. Then the French charged, then the Poitevins, and finally, the Knights Templar. King Richard, riding near the centre, must have felt a flash of pure terror. His army was breaking formation. But Richard was a genius of improvisation. He didn't try to stop the avalanche, he rode the landslide. He signalled for the entire army to commit. The Lionheart drew his sword and galloped into the fray. What happened next was a collision of physics that the medieval world had rarely seen. 17 minutes. That is roughly how long it took for the entire centre of Saladin's army to cease to exist as a cohesive fighting force. To understand why, we have to talk about the physics of a heavy cavalry charge. A warhorse and rider weighed nearly 2,000 pounds combined. When that mass accelerates to 30 miles per hour, it generates terrifying kinetic energy. The Crusader Knights used a technique called couching, locking the lance tightly under their armpit. When they hit the Saracen line, they didn't just stab the enemy, they exploded them. The Saracen light cavalry, caught flat-footed, had no chance. Their lighter horses were knocked sideways. The lances of the Crusaders punched through shields and chainmail. It was a scene of absolute carnage. The dust kicked up by thousands of hooves created a blinding fog of war. In that choking grey cloud, the only things that mattered were the thunder of hooves and the screams of the dying. Saladin's secretary wrote that the charge was like an earthquake. The Saracens tried to fight back with scimitars, but their weapons were designed for speed, not for stopping a freight train. In less time than it takes to eat lunch, the Shadow Army was shattered. But as the Crusaders drove deeper, a new danger emerged. the knights began to scatter, chasing the fleeing enemy into the forest of Arsuf. Richard saw this immediately. He knew that if they entered the trees, they would be ambushed. He had to do the hardest thing a commander can do in the heat of victory. He had to stop it. Richard ordered the army to stop. Imagine the scene. You're a knight with blood pumping in your ears, but you hear the trumpets blasting the signal for halt. It takes a terrifying amount of discipline to pull back on the reins in that moment, but they did it. Richard forced the scattered units to reform their lines, and just in time, Saladin struck back with a vicious counterattack. But because Richard had regrouped, the Crusaders were ready. Richard launched a second wave, a calculated sledgehammer blow. Then, when Saladin tried one last time, Richard answered with a third wave. This punch, regroup, punch rhythm broke Saladin's army completely. The Sultan's troops fled the field for good. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon on September 7th, the noise stopped. For the soldiers of the Third Crusade, it was relief, but for the man sitting in his tent a few miles away, the silence was deafening. Saladin was devastated. Contemporary accounts describe the Sultan in a state of profound shock. He wept. He had done everything right, and yet he had lost. One of his emirs told him, "We could do nothing." Their armour was like a shell of iron. They stood like walls, and when they charged, they struck like demons. The Battle of Arsuf shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility. Across the lines, Richard walked the field. The cost of victory was becoming clear. Saladin lost over 7,000 men. The Crusaders lost fewer than 700. But Richard was looking at a different statistic. He was looking at the horses. During the battle, the Crusaders had lost hundreds of horses to Saracen arrows. Even though they had won the field, their mobility had been crippled. He had smashed Saladin's face, but in doing so, he had broken his own knuckles. In the end, the Battle of Arsuf stands as a masterclass in military history. It proved that a disciplined force could shatter a numerically superior army. Richard had done the impossible. He had secured the coast and opened the path to Jerusalem. But history is rarely a fairy tale. Despite the crushing victory, Richard never reconquered Jerusalem. He realized a cold, hard truth. He could take the city, but he couldn't keep it. Most of his army were pilgrims who would leave, and Saladin would simply retake it. So, the Third Crusade ended not with a bang, but with a handshake. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy City, but Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. Richard sailed for home, and Saladin died shortly after, his empire fracturing. Yet, strangely, Arsuf bound them together forever, the iron wall and the desert wind. Arsuf teaches us that in war, discipline is the only true shield. It teaches us that winning the battle is not the same as winning the war. If you found this deep dive into the Battle of Arsuf fascinating, you're going to love this next video. We explore the Siege of Acre, the brutal precursor to this battle. Click here to watch it now. And before you go, I have a question for you. In the end, who do you think was the greater leader? Richard, for his tactical genius, or Saladin, for his strategic patience? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.